One of the main reasons developers use meta frameworks like Next.js is to handle server-side rendering for search engine optimization. That's because traditionally, websites that are rendered on the server are much easier for search bots to understand, as opposed to websites like single-page applications that are entirely rendered with JavaScript after the initial page load. But with any rendering strategy, there are trade-offs, and that's why Next.js offers a bunch of different ways to render your website, like SSR, pre-rendering, ISR, and client rendering. In my previous Next.js course, I made an entire flowchart explaining the trade-offs of these different rendering strategies. When learning Next.js with the app directory, though, I recommend that you just erase all these terms from your brain. The mental model with server components is far more simplified. Basically, by default, you'll want to make every page a server component. As the name implies, it means that page will be rendered on the server, which is good for SEO. What's confusing at first, though, is that you might want to also use client-side features, like useEffect in React, for example, that don't work in server components. If you try to use client-side features in a server component, the framework will give you an error. The solution is to simply move your interactive code into their own client components, like you want to move them to the leaves of the component tree. This allows your top-level pages to always be server rendered and SEO optimized. Now, what's interesting is that Next.js will automatically try to cache that page to provide an extremely fast page load that has the most up-to-date data for the end user. It does that by analyzing your data fetching code, which we'll talk about in the next video. But for right now, what you need to know is that every page has a dynamic option that you can export that's set to auto by default. However, if you change it to force dynamic, it will behave like get server-side props in previous versions of Next.js that always use server-side rendering without caching, and that's usually ideal for pages that rely on data that changes very often. Or you can change the option to force static, which will tell it to cache the page indefinitely. That would be ideal for a page where the data never changes. Now, there's also a revalidate option that allows you to regenerate a static page after a certain number of seconds have elapsed. This would be the equivalent of ISR in previous versions of Next. Overall, it's good to know that these options exist, but generally speaking, you can just let Next.js figure this stuff out for you automatically. Now, also, when it comes to SEO, it's important to know that you can export a metadata variable that contains information like the title and description of the page. This can be done in any page or layout file, and the values will be automatically added to the head of the document. And if the data is dynamic, you can also export a generate metadata function to create these values on the fly. And that makes SEO extremely easy to deal with in Next.js.